There are a number of physiological variables that influence athletic performance. These include, but are not limited to, percent body fat, volume of oxygen per minute or VO2, maximal volume of oxygen per minute or VO2 max, volume of carbon dioxide per minute or VCO2, the respiratory exchange ratio or RER, pulmonary ventilation or VE, heart rate or HR, fraction of expired air that is oxygen or FeO2, fraction of expired air that is carbon dioxide or FCO2, ventilatory equivalent ratio for oxygen or VE over VO2, ventilatory equivalent ratio for carbon dioxide or VE over VCO2, blood lactate, anaerobic capacity, anaerobic threshold, running economy and mechanical efficiency. Assessment of body composition through percent body fat allows for the determination of the proportions of fat tissue and lean tissue. Percent body fat is the proportion of one's body that consists of fat. There are currently several different methods for assessing percent body fat. The method we use here at the Australian Science and Mathematics School is the percent body fat scale. The scales are made by Tanita and work on the principle that fat is less conductive than muscle. The scale requires the subject to be barefoot, as the scales send a very small and unnoticeable electric current up one leg, and the proportion of the current that returns is entered into an algorithm that takes into account the subject's height, weight and sex. Data collected from the ASMS show that adolescent males on average are between the range of 10 to 20% body fat, and adolescent females are between 20 to 30% body fat. Heart rate is the number of times per minute the heart beats. Cardiac output, the amount of blood pumped out of the heart per minute, is dependent on heart rate and stroke volume. Stroke volume is the amount of blood pumped out per beat. Resting heart rate for most individuals is between 60 to 75 beats per minute. Resting heart rate tends to be lower in individuals who exercise on a regular basis. Maximal heart rate, or HR max values, are frequently estimated based on the subject's age according to the formula heart rate max equals 220 minus age. It should be noted that this formula provides only a very rough estimate of maximum heart rate. Pulmonary ventilation, or VE, is the amount of air moved in and out of the lungs per minute. It is dependent on the depth of each breath and the number of breaths taken per minute. At rest, most individuals have a pulmonary ventilation of between 6 to 10 litres of air per minute. During maximal exercise, pulmonary ventilation values, or VE max, are in the range of 100 to 170 litres per minute for most individuals. In elite rowers, values of up to 250 litres per minute have been recorded. Pulmonary ventilation increases linearly with volume of oxygen and workload until about 60% of maximal oxygen volume. Beyond this point, pulmonary ventilation increases at a higher rate than oxygen volume. Oxygen consumption is the amount of oxygen taken up and utilised by the body. The oxygen taken into the body at the lungs is used for the production of ATP in the mitochondria of our cells. Because most of the energy in the body is produced aerobically, volume of oxygen can be used indirectly to determine how much energy a subject is expending. Volume of oxygen can be reported in absolute terms in litres of oxygen per minute or relative to body mass in millilitres of oxygen per kilogram of body mass per minute. Oxygen consumption is dependent on the ability of the heart to pump out blood, the ability of the tissues to extract oxygen from the blood, the ability to ventilate, and the ability of the alveoli to extract oxygen from the air. Volume of oxygen per minute is equal to the heart rate multiplied by the stroke volume multiplied by the alveolar oxygen difference. Resting absolute values for volume of oxygen tend to be around 200 to 500 millilitres per minute in men and 150 to 400 millilitres per minute in women. The approximate resting relative volume of oxygen for all individuals is 3.5 millilitres of oxygen per kilogram of body mass per minute. Maximal oxygen consumption, or VO2 max, is the highest volume of oxygen value recorded during maximal exercise. VO2 max is thought to be the best indicator of aerobic capacity and therefore aerobic fitness. VO2 max is a relatively good predictor of endurance performance. VO2 max tends to be higher in males than females. Adolescent males have on average a VO2 max of 45 millilitres of oxygen per kilogram of body mass per minute, and adolescent females have a VO2 max of about 35 millilitres of oxygen per kilogram of body mass per minute. The highest absolute VO2 max values have been recorded in large endurance athletes such as elite heavyweight rowers with values of over 7 litres per minute recorded. The highest relative VO2 max values are typically recorded in small endurance athletes such as cross-country skiers, cyclists and distance runners, in particular middle distance runners, with values of up to 90 millilitres of oxygen per kilogram of body mass per minute recorded. VO2 max tests can also be used clinically to assess the type and severity of cardiovascular or pulmonary limitations to exercise. VO2 max can increase with training. An untrained individual may be able to increase VO2 max by as much as 15 to 20%. In well-trained athletes, increases in VO2 max may not be as great, but with continued training they can become more efficient or economical such that they can go faster for a given oxygen consumption. Additionally, the percent of VO2 max that the athlete can sustain for prolonged periods of time is also very trainable. The volume of carbon dioxide, or CO2, is a byproduct of cellular metabolic processes. Most of the CO2 given off by the body comes from the cellular respiration. However, during high-intensity exercise, some of the CO2 that the subject is blowing off comes from the breakdown of blood bicarbonate ions by lactate ions, releasing CO2. The respiratory exchange ratio is the ratio of carbon dioxide production to oxygen consumption, or VCO2 over VO2. At rest and during low-intensity exercise, the respiratory exchange ratio reflects the type of fuel substrates being used by the cells for the production of ATP. For example, a respiratory exchange ratio closer to 0.70 suggests that primarily fats are being used for the production of energy, whereas a respiratory exchange ratio closer to 1.0 suggests that primarily carbohydrates are being used. During high-intensity exercise, some of the CO2 that the subject is blowing off comes from buffering of the blood, and thus no longer reflects solely cellular metabolic events. The normal range for respiratory exchange ratio at rest and during low-intensity exercise is 0.7 to 1.0, but values may exceed 1.2 during high-intensity exercise. The fraction of expired air that is oxygen, or FeO2, is the percent of expired air that is oxygen. The air we breathe in is 20.93% oxygen, and we typically extract 3 to 6% of the air that is oxygen. The air that we exhale is usually 15 to 18% oxygen. Low values for FeO2 suggest the subject is extracting oxygen well and suggest that gas exchange in the alveoli is good. The fraction of expired air that is carbon dioxide, or FeCO2, is the percent of expired air that is carbon dioxide. The air that we breathe in has very little carbon dioxide, normally 0.03%. Carbon dioxide is produced as a result of cellular metabolism, and thus most of the CO2 exhaled comes from metabolic processes. Typically the air that we exhale is 2.5 to 6% carbon dioxide. The ventilatory equivalent ratio for oxygen is equal to the pulmonary ventilation VE divided by oxygen consumption, or VO2. At the anaerobic threshold, when a significant amount of energy is coming from anaerobic metabolism, there is an increase in lactic acid in the blood. In order to keep the blood from becoming too acidic, ventilation increases and helps blow off excess CO2. At this point, VE increases at a higher rate than oxygen consumption, and thus the ratio of VE over VO2 begins to increase. The VE over VO2 can also be used as an index of ventilatory efficiency. If the subject's lungs are very efficient at gas exchange, the subject will not need a very high VE for a given VO2. The ventilatory equivalent ratio for carbon dioxide is calculated by dividing VE by VCO2. Lactic acid is one of the products of anaerobic carbohydrate metabolism in the cells. Because lactic acid is a relatively strong acid, it is usually found in the body in the form of the lactate ion as it dissociates from its hydrogen ions. The amount of lactic acid in the blood at the end of maximal exercise test reflects 1. The intensity of the exercise for the subject, 2. The degree to which the subject needed to supplement aerobic energy production with anaerobic energy production, and 3. The subject's lactic acid tolerance. It should be noted that the amount of lactic acid in the blood at any point in time is dependent on both how much is entering the circulation through production and how much is being removed from the circulation by being cleared. For example, endurance-trained subjects will tend to have a lower blood lactate value at any given running speed or intensity than an untrained subject. This difference is owed partly to 1. Better ability to use aerobic metabolism in the trained subjects, and 2. A better ability to remove lactate from the circulation. It is not uncommon to find very high maximal blood lactate values in athletes competing in high-intensity events, or in relation to our treadmill test towards the end of the test. Resting blood lactate is typically close to 1 millimolar. The anaerobic threshold is said to be around 4 millimolar, and one criterion for a valid VO2 max test is a value exceeding 8 millimolar. In elite athletes competing in events lasting 2 to 6 minutes, values have been reported to exceed 25 millimolar. At intensities lower than the anaerobic threshold, or AT, almost all of the energy needed to perform the exercise is coming from aerobic energy systems. At intensities above this threshold, anaerobic energy production is needed to supplement aerobic energy production. For an average person, the anaerobic threshold occurs at 50 to 60% of VO2 max. In highly trained runners, the anaerobic threshold is typically between 75 and 90% of VO2 max. There are several ways of assessing anaerobic threshold. Individuals with a high VO2 max typically also have a high anaerobic threshold, but the relationship between anaerobic threshold and VO2 max is highly variable. Having a high anaerobic threshold is probably more important for long-distance runners, and having a high VO2 max is probably more important for middle-distance runners such as 1500. To be successful, middle-distance runners also must have a great ability to tolerate high concentrations of lactic acid. If it appears that VO2 max is as high as it can go for a particular athlete, then one way the athlete can continue to improve performance would be to modify their training to focus on improving their anaerobic threshold. The classic way of assessing the anaerobic threshold is by assessing blood lactate continuously throughout the test and identifying the point where blood lactate begins to accumulate. This is also called the lactate threshold. However, it is not always convenient to take blood lactates throughout the test. Certainly here at the Australian Science and Mathematics School and South Australian state government schools in general, blood sampling is not acceptable. There is a non-invasive means of estimating the anaerobic threshold using the ventilatory response to exercise. The ventilatory threshold can be determined using several different methods. One of these methods is to identify the point when the ventilatory equivalent ratio for oxygen begins to continuously increase. Running economy reflects how efficient an athlete is. An athlete who is more efficient can run faster for a given oxygen consumption of VO2. It also means that if two athletes are running at the same VO2, the one who is more economical will be able to run faster.